In the military history of the Vietnam War, there is a common misconception that the greatest threat to an infantryman was a bullet. It wasn't. For the soldiers patrolling the deep canopy of Phuoc Tuy province, the greatest threat was the ground beneath their boots. In this war, the earth was a liar. A patch of flat, dry leaves looked like a safe place to step, but it was often a thin covering over a frantic viper pit or a bamboo spike smeared with feces. A sturdy vine crossing the trail looked like natural vegetation, but it was a trigger for a grenade stuffed inside a rusty, condensed milk can. A harmless tree branch blocking the path was an invitation to push it aside, an action that would pull a pin and unleash hell. The Viet Cong, VC, and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, were masters of this passive warfare. They understood that they could not match the firepower of the Free World forces in a head-to-head stand-up fight. So, they turned the jungle itself into a weapon. They became engineers of death, utilizing a terrifying ingenuity to turn everyday objects and the enemy's own trash into lethal traps. For the average American infantryman, the grunt this environment was a psychological meat grinder. American doctrine relied on firepower and aggression. They moved in large formations, often noisy and heavy-footed, their eyes scanning the tree line for ambushes. Because they were looking up for the enemy, they often missed what was down at their feet. The result was a horrific casualty rate from booby traps, creating a sense of paranoia that paralyzed entire platoons. But the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, fought a different war. To an SAS patrol, the jungle was not a place to be conquered, it was a text to be read. They operated in small five-man teams, moving with a silence that bordered on the supernatural. They didn't hack through the bush, they flowed through it. And most importantly, they looked down. The point man, the lead scout of the SAS patrol, was the highest practitioner of an ancient art known as visual tracking. While the American soldier looked for a target to shoot, the Australian scout looked for a story in the dirt. He wasn't looking for a tripwire. He was looking for the absence of spiderwebs across a trail, which indicated someone had passed through recently. He was looking for a single leaf that had been overturned, revealing its darker, wet underside. He was looking for a tiny smudge of mud on a root that was slightly out of place. To the untrained eye, the jungle floor was chaotic mess. To the SAS scout, it was a perfectly ordered system, and any anomaly, no matter how microscopic, screamed danger. This hyper-awareness created a unique dynamic. The SAS didn't just stumble into traps. They hunted them. They treated the ground with a mix of respect and suspicion, knowing that the enemy was constantly trying to outsmart them. However, the game was evolving. The VC were no longer just using sharpened bamboo and rusty nails. They had begun to harvest the Americans' own technology. They were stealing the most devastating ambush weapon in the U.S. arsenal, the M18A1 Claymore Mine, and turning it against its creators. The SAS were about to find that their enemy wasn't just hiding in the dirt. They were waiting to feed the Australians their own medicine. In the arsenal of the Vietnam War, few weapons were as distinctively terrifying as the M18A1 Claymore Mine. Unlike the buried pressure mines of previous wars, which waited passively for a clumsy footstep, the Claymore was an active instrument of ambush. It was an anti-personnel weapon designed for one purpose: to erase human waves. Physically, it looked innocuous, a curved, olive-drab plastic box about the size of a large book, standing on two scissor-like metal legs. But inside that plastic casing lay 5 pounds of C4 plastic explosive, backed by a matrix of 700 steel ball bearings. When detonated, the C4 exploded backward, driving the steel balls forward in a 60-degree fan-shaped arc. The result was a giant, instantaneous shotgun blast. Within a 50-meter kill zone, the swarm of steel flew at supersonic speeds, shredding vegetation, equipment, and flesh indiscriminately. It didn't just wound, it deleted. But the most iconic feature of the Claymore was the instruction embossed on its convex face in raised capital letters: front toward enemy. It was a simple instruction for the American GI, a reminder to point the convex side toward the threat. But in the fluid, 360-degree battlefield of Vietnam, the definition of front and enemy became dangerously ambiguous. For the Viet Cong and the NVA, the Claymore Mine was not a weapon to be feared. It was a prize to be coveted. The communist forces struggled with logistics. Their homemade mines, often constructed from bamboo, black powder, and rusty nails were dangerous but unreliable. They rotted in the humidity, they failed to detonate, they lacked the devastating punch of military-grade high explosives. The Claymore, by contrast, was a masterpiece of engineering. It was waterproof, rot-proof, and brutally effective. For a VC sapper, stealing a Claymore was like finding a bar of solid gold. Why build a crude explosive device when the Americans were kind enough to bring thousands of perfect ones into the jungle? This realization birthed a terrifying tactic. The NVA deployed elite sapper units, men who could move through barbed wire like smoke, specifically to harvest these mines. They would crawl up to the perimeters of U.S. fire support bases at night, inches at a time. While the American sentries stared out into the darkness, the sappers would locate the defensive claymores planted earlier that evening. In a display of nerves that defies comprehension, the sapper would not cut the wire. Instead, he would carefully unplug the blasting cap, lift the mine from its legs, and vanish back into the night with the prize. But sometimes they were more malicious. Sometimes they didn't steal the mine. They simply turned it around. They would rotate the mine 180 degrees, so the front toward enemy lettering was now facing the American foxhole. They would then recamouflage it and slip away. When the American sentry, panicked by a noise in the wire, squeezed the clacker, detonator, to blow the mine, he wouldn't kill the enemy. He would blow himself up with his own weapon. This was the environment the SAS stepped into. They were facing an enemy who had turned the Allied technological advantage into a liability. The jungle was now seeded not just with bamboo spikes, but with American steel, waiting to turn the tables on anyone who didn't respect the ground they walked on. To the logistics officers of the North Vietnamese Army, American fire support bases were not just military obstacles, they were supermarkets. The Americans were wealthy in high explosives, but poor in discipline. They ringed their bases with defensive perimeters of claymores, relying on the mines to do the watching for them. For the elite NVA sappers, the Dak Kong, this was an invitation. The Dak Kong were the stuff of nightmares for Allied troops. They were not conscripts. They were highly trained specialists in infiltration, operating often in nothing but loincloths, their bodies smeared with grease or charcoal to blend into the shadows and slip through barbed wire. They could breathe as quietly as a sleeping infant. Their primary mission was often destruction, but a secondary, equally vital mission was harvesting. Under the cover of monsoon rains or moonless nights, a sapper would belly crawl through the layers of concertina wire surrounding an American or Australian base. He would move with agonizing slowness, sometimes taking an hour to move 10 meters. His target was the distinct curved silhouette of the M18A1 Claymore planted on the berm. The audacity of this act cannot be overstated. The Claymore was usually live, armed, and connected by a firing wire to a clacker, the M57 handheld generator, held by a sentry just 30 meters away. If the sentry saw a shadow or heard a twig snap, he would squeeze the clacker, and the sapper would be vaporized. Yet night after night, they did it. The sapper would locate the mine, gently trace the wire back to the firing mechanism, and sever it. Then, he would lift the mine, fold the legs, and vanish into the jungle, adding another weapon to the NVA inventory. But the sappers possessed a dark sense of humor. Sometimes, the goal wasn't theft, it was sabotage. In one of the war's grimmest ironies, sappers would occasionally creep up to a defensive claymore and simply rotate it 180 degrees. They would leave the wire connected. They would leave the mine sitting on its legs. But now, the front toward enemy warnings were facing the sandbags of the Allied bunker. Later that night, when the sappers launched a noisy probing attack to startle the sentries, the terrified GI on watch would instinctively squeeze the clacker to clear his perimeter. Instead of decimating the charging enemy, the mine would detonate directly into his own face. It was a psychological masterstroke, making the enemy afraid to fire his own weapons. However, against the SAS, the tactic was different. The SAS didn't sit in bases. They patrolled the deep bush. So the NVA took their stolen prizes, along with Chinese copies like the DH-10, out to the trails. They created mechanical ambushes. They would lash a stolen claymore to the base of a tree, camouflaged with ferns. Instead of a command wire held by a soldier, they would rig it with a tripwire strung tight across the patrol path, ankle-high. The setup was brutal in its simplicity. An SAS patrol, moving silently through the green gloom, would theoretically snag the wire. The circuit would close. The stolen American mine would unleash its 700 steel balls at point-blank range, shredding the legs and torsos of the lead scouts. It was a way for the NVA to kill the phantoms of the jungle without ever having to pull a trigger themselves. In the deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the Vietnamese jungle, the American GI relied on technology. He had motion sensors, starlight scopes, and massive firepower. The Australian SAS trooper relied on something far older and far more reliable: his eyes. They called it visual tracking, but to witness it in action was to see something bordering on telepathy. The SASR had learned their trade from the best trackers in the world, Aboriginal Australians and the native trackers of Borneo and Malaya. They didn't just look at the jungle, they looked through the layers of visual noise to find the anomalies. The lead scout, the point man, was the priest of this religion. He moved with a peculiar, flowing gait, knees bent, weapon up, eyes constantly scanning in a figure-8 pattern. He wasn't looking for the enemy soldier himself. He was looking for the ghost the soldier left behind. While an American unit might blunder down a trail, oblivious to the story written in the dirt, the SAS point man would freeze mid-step because of a single, misplaced leaf. Why is that leaf overturned? In the damp jungle, the underside of a leaf is darker and wetter than the top. If a boot scuffs it over, it stands out like a neon sign to a trained eye. Why is there no spider web across this gap? Spiders in Vietnam were industrious. They rebuilt webs across trails every few hours. An open path meant something large had passed through recently. Why is that smear of mud on the route slightly lighter? It means it's drying. Someone stepped here an hour ago. This hypersensitivity extended to man-made threats. The NVA were clever with their tripwires, often using fishing line or green thread that was nearly invisible against the foliage. But the SAS developed a third eye for these traps. They looked for the unnatural straight lines in a world of curves. They looked for the telltale tension on a blade of elephant grass that was being pulled slightly against the wind. It was this skill that saved them from the stolen claymores. There are documented accounts of SAS patrols halting abruptly because the point man sensed rather than saw something wrong. Maybe it was a slight discoloration on a tree trunk where moss had been scraped away to lash a mine. Maybe it was a tiny glint of copper wire hidden in the ferns. Stop, the scout would signal with a flat hand. The patrol would freeze instantly, melting into the vegetation. No words were spoken. They didn't need radios. The silence was absolute. The scout would then slowly, agonizingly, lower himself to the ground. He would crawl forward, inch by inch, peering through the undergrowth. And there it would be, the dull green curve of an M18A1 Claymore, stolen from a U.S. base, rigged with a tripwire across their path. An ordinary soldier might have panicked or simply blown it up from a distance, but the SAS were different. They saw the trap not as a threat to be destroyed, but as an opportunity to be exploited. They realized that if the enemy had gone to the trouble of setting a trap, they expected it to work, and that expectation was a weakness. The point man would look back at his team, a grim smile forming beneath his camouflage paint. They weren't going to destroy the mine. They were going to give it back. When an American infantry unit discovered a booby trap, the standard procedure was loud and final: blow it in place. They would attach a block of C4, retreat to a safe distance, and detonate it. It removed the threat, but it also announced their position to every enemy soldier within 5 kilometers. The SAS operated differently. Silence was their armor. Blowing up a trap was a failure of stealth, but simply bypassing it was a missed opportunity. This mindset gave birth to one of the most ruthless tactics of the Vietnam War: the Claymore Boomerang. Once the point man had identified the stolen NVA Claymore lashed to a tree, the patrol leader would make a silent hand signal: deal with it. The point man would set down his rifle and inch forward. This was the most dangerous 2 minutes in a soldier's life. He was crawling toward a device designed to shred him, rigged by an enemy whose engineering skills were crude but unpredictable. He had to assume the NVA had placed a secondary anti-handling device, a grenade with the pin pulled underneath the mine so he couldn't just grab it. With the precision of a surgeon, the trooper would inspect the mine. He would trace the tripwire, usually a piece of fishing line or simple green thread, back to the firing device, often a crude clothespin keeping 2 contacts apart. He would carefully insert a safety pin or a twig to neutralize the trigger. Then came the twist. Instead of disarming the mine and taking it with him, the SAS trooper would carefully detach the claymore from the tree. He would then rotate it 180 degrees. Original NVA orientation. Front-facing the SAS approach. New SAS orientation. Front-facing the NVA approach. He would lash it back to the tree, perhaps slightly lower or better camouflage than before, using the superior fieldcraft skills that only the SAS possessed. He would reset the tripwire, ensuring it was taut and invisible. The trap was now live again. But the geometry of death had been reversed. The logic behind the boomerang was cold and calculating. The SAS knew that NVA patrols often used the same trails. They also knew that the NVA felt safe near their own traps. An enemy soldier walking down that track would know exactly where the mine was. He would walk confidently, perhaps even stepping over his own tripwire, thinking the trap was set for the Australians. He wouldn't look at the face of the mine. He wouldn't notice that the lethal, convex curve, the side reading front toward enemy, was now staring directly at him. When the SAS patrol vanished into the jungle, they left behind a ticking time bomb of irony. Hours or days later, an NVA patrol would come down the track. Maybe they would trip the wire themselves. Maybe they would send a scout to check if the trap was still intact. The result was the same. The jungle would erupt with the roar of C4. 700 steel balls would scream through the air, but they would fly in the opposite direction of what the NVA intended. The psychological impact of the boomerang was devastating. When the NVA survivors investigated the carnage, they would find the remnants of their own mine. It bred a paralyzing paranoia. If they couldn't trust their own traps, what could they trust? The jungle, which had always been their ally, had been turned against them by ghosts who could manipulate death without firing a shot. The boomerang tactic was effective, but the SAS were perfectionists. They knew they were fighting a sophisticated enemy. The NVA and Viet Cong sappers were not mindless conscripts. They were seasoned veterans who knew mines as well as the Australians did. The SAS realized a potential flaw in their strategy. What if the enemy spotted the reversed mine? An observant NVA scout might notice the claymore had been tampered with. His instinct wouldn't be to trip the wire. It would be to recover the valuable weapon. He would disarm the tripwire, pick up the mine, and take it back to his base to use another day. So, the SAS decided to punish the sin of greed. They introduced the anti-lift device. This was a tactic that turned the act of disarming a trap into a suicide mission. The setup required nerves of steel. After the SAS trooper had performed the boomerang maneuver, reversing the claymore to face the enemy approach, he wouldn't just walk away. He would dig a shallow, saucer-sized depression in the earth, directly beneath where the mine was seated. He would then take an M26 fragmentation grenade from his webbing. The M26 has a safety lever, the spoon, held in place by a pin. Once the pin is pulled, the spoon flies off, the fuse ignites, and 4 seconds later it explodes. The SAS trooper would pull the pin on the grenade, but, and this is the crucial part, he would keep his thumb firmly pressing the spoon down. The grenade was now live, held in check only by the pressure of his hand. He would carefully place the grenade into the hole he had dug. Then, with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert, he would place the heavy M18A1 Claymore mine directly on top of the grenade. The weight of the 3.5-pound mine was sufficient to hold the grenade spoon down. The trap was now a two-stage nightmare. Stage 1, the tripwire. If an NVA soldier stumbled into the wire, the claymore detonated, killing him. Stage 2, the anti-lift. If a smart NVA sapper spotted the wire, cut it, and reached down to lift the safe mine off the ground to steal it. Click. The moment the weight of the mine was removed, the grenade spoon would ping off the metal casing of the grenade. The sapper would hear the fuse ignite a soft hiss that signaled he had exactly 4 seconds left to live. But usually, the surprise was so total that he would freeze. When the grenade detonated, it exploded upwards, unprotected by the ground. At zero range, the effects were absolute. The genius of the anti-lift was that it weaponized the enemy's competence. It killed the experts. It killed the careful ones. It killed the men who were smart enough to find the first trap, but arrogant enough to think they had outsmarted the SAS. This technique sent a chilling message through the NVA ranks. It changed the protocol for handling discovered mines. No longer could a sapper simply pick up an allied device. Every single object on the jungle floor had to be treated as if it were sitting on a trigger. It slowed their movements to a crawl. The fear of the click under the mine became as potent a psychological weapon as the explosive itself. For the SAS, leaving an anti-lift device was the final signature on their work. It was a way of saying, "We were here, we saw your trap, and we made it better." In the calculus of guerrilla warfare, morale is a resource as vital as ammunition. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fought with a fierce determination, buoyed by the belief that the land was theirs. They knew the terrain, they knew the trails, and they knew where they had planted their traps. This knowledge gave them a sense of security in an otherwise chaotic war. The SAS stole that security. The boomerang and anti-lift tactics did far more damage than the shrapnel they unleashed. They injected a potent venom into the psyche of the enemy: paranoia. Imagine the mindset of an NVA platoon commander. He sends a patrol down a supply track that his engineers rigged with stolen claymores just 2 days ago. He expects to hear the explosion that signals an Australian patrol has been destroyed. Instead, he hears the explosion. But when the dust settles, he finds his own men dead, shredded by the very mine they had marked on their maps as friendly. The first time it happened, they might have blamed it on a faulty installation or a clumsy soldier. But when it happened again, and again when mines faced the wrong way, when grenades exploded under safe objects, a chilling realization took hold. The jungle was no longer theirs. It had been infested by ghosts. This psychological warfare achieved a tactical result that airstrikes and artillery never could. It forced the NVA to slow down. Speed is life in guerrilla warfare. The ability to move supplies and troops unseen and quickly is the insurgents' greatest advantage. But now, every step on a secure trail was a gamble. NVA patrols could no longer walk confidently past their own traps. Every tripwire had to be re-inspected. Every mine had to be approached with the terrifying suspicion that an SAS trooper had touched it in the night. The mere sight of a claymore lashed to a tree, an object that should have represented strength, became a source of dread. Interrogations of captured enemy soldiers revealed the extent of this fear. They spoke of the Australian SAS not as soldiers, but as Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The Americans were loud and heavy. You could hear them coming, fight them, or run away. But the Australians were silent. You didn't know they were there until your own weapon blew up in your face. The SAS had achieved the ultimate goal of special operations: force multiplication through fear. By turning a few dozen mines around, they created a zone of uncertainty that stretched for miles. An NVA company might delay a movement for hours because they found one booby trap tampered with, fearing that the entire route had been compromised. The SAS didn't just kill the enemy. They made the enemy afraid of the ground, afraid of the trees, and worst of all, afraid of their own weapons. The betrayal of the inanimate object, the feeling that your own gun is pointed at you, even when you're holding it, broke the spirit in a way that direct combat never could. The history of the Vietnam War is often painted in broad strokes of overwhelming firepower: B-52 airstrikes, napalm runs, and the deafening roar of artillery. It was a war where the American doctrine attempted to solve a tactical puzzle with a sledgehammer. But the story of the Claymore Boomerang reveals a different kind of warfare, one fought in the quiet spaces between the explosions, where the greatest weapon was not a bomb, but a brain. The Australian SAS regiment proved that in the jungle, high explosives are useless without high intelligence. They didn't survive their tours by being the strongest men in the fight. They survived by being the smartest. The boomerang and anti-lift tactics were not just clever field tricks. They were the physical manifestation of a superior combat philosophy. The NVA and Viet Cong were formidable because they were adaptable. They turned unexploded ordnance into mines. They turned bamboo into spikes. They were the masters of using the environment against the invader. The SAS's genius lay in their ability to outplay the masters at their own game. They didn't just walk into the jungle, they decoded it. They understood that a trap is only a trap if you don't see it. Once seen, it becomes a resource. By refusing to destroy the enemy's mines and instead subverting them, they engaged in a kind of tactical judo, using the enemy's own weight and aggression to throw them to the ground. This approach created a kill ratio that remains legendary in military history. The SAS inflicted casualties on the enemy at a rate of 500 to 1, while suffering minimal losses themselves. This wasn't because they had better guns. They often used the same caliber as the US, or better armor. They wore none. It was because they treated warfare as a thinking man's game. The legacy of the Claymore Boomerang is a stark lesson in the economy of war. It demonstrated that a single soldier, armed with nothing but a safety pin and a terrifying imagination, could be more effective than an entire battery of artillery. When the dust settled and the war ended, the stories that terrified the NVA veterans weren't about the times they were bombed from 30,000 feet. They were about the times they walked down a silent trail, secure in their knowledge of the terrain, only to be destroyed by their own devices. The SAS had rewritten the rules of the jungle. They taught the enemy a brutal final lesson. The phrase "front toward enemy" is not just an instruction on a plastic box. It is a warning. And if you are not careful, if you are not observant, and if you are not smarter than the phantom hunting you, the enemy might just be the weapon you are holding in your own hands.